Imagine a room filled with the rhythmic sound of shattering glass. It is the mid-19th century. We are standing in a bottling plant in London or New York, surrounded by rows of men wearing iron cages over their heads. Heavy, rusted wire mesh covers their faces and necks. Their hands are sheathed in thick leather gauntlets that reach to their elbows. They look like medieval warriors preparing for battle, but they are merely making soda. The atmosphere in these factories is one of constant rhythmic tension. The air is hot, humid, and thick with the smell of machine oil, wet sawdust, and the sharp metallic tang of carbonic acid. These men are not wearing armor as a fashion statement. They are wearing it because the bottle in their hand is not a beverage container. It is a pressurized bomb waiting for an excuse to detonate. When the glass fails under 60 pounds of pressure, it does not simply crack, it explodes. A sharp, violent crack echoes through the room, followed by the musical tinkle of shrapnel hitting the sawdust floor. Glass shards fly with enough velocity to blind a man instantly or sever the arteries in his wrist. The wire mesh of the mask is there to catch the shrapnel before it embeds itself in the worker's eyes. The leather gauntlets are there to protect the arteries from being sliced open by flying, jagged shards. Now picture the object in your hand today. It is a cylinder of thin, cold aluminium. It is dripping with condensation. You run your thumb under the tab. You pull. There is a sharp, metallic crack, followed immediately by the violent hiss of escaping gas. But this time, there is no explosion, no shrapnel, no iron mask required. Before the liquid even touches your tongue, the smell hits you. It is a specific kind of sweetness, sharp, acidic, and entirely artificial. It smells of citric acid and high fructose syrup. It is the smell of the modern world. You take a sip. The bubbles prick your tongue. It is consistent. It is safe. You trust that it will not explode in your hand. But I want you to pause for a moment and consider the sheer industrial feat of that sensation. That hiss is the sound of a 3-century war against nature. It is the sound of chemists losing their eyesight, of ships sinking in the tropical heat, and of the iron cages that once protected the men who dared to trap this ghost in glass. Tonight, we are going to strip away the bright red labels and the plastic bottles. We are going to pour out the modern convenience and look at the sludge that remains at the bottom of the glass. Welcome to the archives. I invite you to settle in and find a comfortable chair. I am here to guide you through the sensory reality of the past, and tonight, that reality is carbonated. The history of soda is not a culinary evolution, it is a logistical struggle. The story of how humanity tried to bottle a natural miracle and sell it for a nickel. The drink you know today is merely the sanitized ghost of a much grittier ancestor. The version we are going to taste tonight does not smell like vanilla and lime. It carries the scent of sulfuric acid, fermenting roots, wet sawdust, and damp horsehair. It tastes of iron and medicine. This history is written in explosions, shrapnel, and shattered glass. So, dim the lights. Forget the vending machine down the hall. We are stepping back into a world that was quieter, darker, and significantly more dangerous. In this world, the bubbles in your glass were not a cheap commodity. They were a medical necessity, a mysterious spirit that could cure the sick or kill the bottle washer. If you are lucky, it might just cure you. To understand why we are so obsessed with this fizzy sugar water, we cannot start in the factory. We cannot even start in the apothecary. We must go further back, before the invention of the machine, to the only place where the water fizzed on its own. We must go to the source. Imagine standing in a damp, rocky grotto. The air is heavy with the smell of rotten eggs, sulfur. The ground is warm, almost feverish beneath your boots. And there, bubbling up from the deep, thick mud, is the original soda fountain. It is violent, it is hot, and unlike the can in your hand, it is alive. To understand the obsession, you must first understand the alternative. Before the invention of the machine, Carbonation was not a product, it was a place. Picture the ground beneath your feet opening up. You are standing at the edge of a natural mineral spring in the volcanic regions of Europe. It is not the polite, tiled pool of a modern hotel spa. It is a geological wound. The water is not clear. It is often murky, stained orange by iron or milky white by calcium. And it is loud. The water does not just sit there. It boils up from the deep earth, churning and spitting as if it is angry. The first thing you notice is not the sight, but the smell. It is pungent. It smells of rotten eggs. That is the sulfur, a heavy, choking brimstone scent that clings to the back of your throat. The ground is warm, heated by the same magma chambers that are pushing the gas to the surface. To the ancient mind, this was not chemistry, it was theology. This was the underworld leaking into the world of the living. And yet, the Romans were obsessed with it. They built massive stone complexes around these vents, turning the chaotic mud into ordered, architectural marvels. They came here to bathe, yes, but more importantly, they came here to drink. Imagine dipping a clay cup into that violent, churning water. You lift it to your lips. The liquid is warm, perhaps even hot. You take a sip. It does not taste like the sanitized, sugary soda you know. It tastes like licking a rusty nail. It is metallic, salty, and bitter. It tastes of the rock it just tore through. But as it hits your tongue, you feel that familiar prickle. The bubbles. The spirit. In a world where all other water was still and stagnant, or worse, dangerous to drink, this water felt alive. It danced in the mouth. It cleared the sinuses. It made you belch, which the Romans considered a sign that the body was balancing its humours. They drank it for everything. Indigestion, gout, rheumatism, melancholia. They believed the water could dissolve stones in the bladder and clarify the blood. But there was a catch. There was always a catch. This miracle was geographically locked. You could only experience the living water if you were standing right there at the source. This created a profound logistical frustration that haunted humanity for centuries. The moment you tried to take the miracle home, it died. Picture a wealthy Roman senator. He visits the spring, feels the relief in his gouty joints, and decides he wants this water in his villa in the city. He orders a servant to fill a clay amphora. They seal it tight with wax and cork. They wrap it in straw to keep it safe. They load it onto a cart. But the journey home is long and bumpy. The clay is porous, the seal is imperfect, and the spirit, the gas, is elusive. It wants to escape. By the time the senator uncorks that jug in his dining room, the violence is gone. The hiss is silent. The water is flat, cold, and dead. Without the carbonation to lift the heavy minerals, the water just tastes like sludge. It is heavy, metallic, and nauseating. The magic has evaporated into the air. This reality created a strict social hierarchy of hydration. If you wanted the bubbles, you had to travel. You needed the leisure time to leave your work, the money to pay for the journey, and the health to survive the trip. Taking the waters was the exclusive privilege of the elite. For centuries, this was the rule. The fixed air, as early scientists began to call it, was a ghost. It appeared, it danced, and it vanished. It was considered a mysterious, almost supernatural element that defied captivity. Philosophers and alchemists looked at the bubbling mud and saw a puzzle they could not solve. They knew that if they could capture that ghost, if they could trap the spirit in a bottle and keep it alive, they would not just be solving a logistical problem, they would be bottling money. But for a very long time, the spring kept its secret, and the rest of the world was forced to drink their water flat. Now, step away from the sun-drenched Italian grotto. We are moving north to a place where the air is colder, damper, and smells significantly worse. The year is 1767. We are in Leeds, England. The man of the hour is Joseph Priestley, a clergyman with a restless mind and a very specific housing situation. He does not live near a magical volcanic spring. He lives next door to a brewery. If you have never stood inside an 18th century brewery, you must understand that it is not a sterile environment. It is a place of aggressive biology. The air is thick, humid, and heavy with the smell of wet grain and yeast. It is a sweet, rotting scent that clings to your clothes and settles in your hair. In the center of this room are massive vats of fermenting mash, bubbling away in the dark. Priestley was fascinated by these vats. He noticed that a heavy, invisible layer of air hung directly over the fermenting liquid. The workmen knew about this layer. They knew it as a silent killer. If a man fell into the vat, or even leaned too far over the edge and breathed in deeply, he would lose consciousness and suffocate. It was a blanket of death hovering just inches above the beer. Priestley, being a man of science, did not see death. He saw fixed air. This fixed air was carbon dioxide, though he did not call it that yet. He suspected this was the same spirit that danced in the Roman springs. So, he devised an experiment. It was not high-tech. It was, frankly, a bit desperate. He walked out onto the narrow plank that spanned the top of the fermenting vat. Below him, the grain was churning and releasing its gas. The heat would have been intense. The smell would have been suffocating. He held a bowl of water. In a modern laboratory, we force gas into water with high-pressure tanks and steel regulators. Priestley had none of that. He simply suspended the bowl of cool, distilled water just above the surface of the rotting mash. He let it hang there in the fixed air. It was a passive, quiet process. He was relying on the fact that carbon dioxide is heavy. It pooled over the beer, and slowly, over the course of hours, the water in the bowl began to absorb the gas. It was not efficient. It was agonizingly slow. The water had to sit in that humid, yeasty fog, drinking in the spirit of the grain. To speed it up, Priestley would sometimes pour the water back and forth between two glasses, holding them directly over the fumes, trying to trap the gas as it fell. Imagine him there, in the dim light of the brewery, pouring water from cup to cup like a bartender making a very slow, very dangerous cocktail, breathing shallowly to avoid passing out. When he finally tasted the water, the result was subtle. It did not explode on the tongue like a modern soda. It had a gentle, prickly sensation. It was slightly sour, acidulous, as he called it. It mimicked the texture of the mineral waters from the Piedmont Spring in Germany. He had done the impossible. He had taken plain, dead water and given it a ghost. He had impregnated it with fixed air without ever leaving Leeds. But this was not a business. This was a parlour trick. It was a curiosity for the Royal Society, a way to impress intellectuals after dinner. The process was entirely dependent on the brewery. If the beer wasn't fermenting, you didn't get any soda. If the wind blew the wrong way, the gas dispersed. The water itself was weak, barely sparkling, and it went flat almost immediately. There was no way to bottle this. There was no way to sell it. It was just a bowl of slightly sour water hovering over a vat of beer. It was a scientific triumph, but a logistical dead end. To turn this curiosity into a commodity, the gas had to be taken out of the brewery. It had to be generated on command, and to do that, the process would have to get much more violent. The passive absorption of the brewery was about to be replaced by the aggressive chemistry of the apothecary. The bowl was about to be replaced by the bladder, and the smell of yeast was about to be replaced by the smell of burning sulfur. We are leaving the warm, yeasty air of the brewery behind. We are stepping into a colder, sharper environment, the laboratory of the late 18th century. Joseph Priestley eventually moved on from his passive bowls of water. He realized that waiting for a vat of beer to ferment was not science, it was patience. He wanted to command the gas, not beg for it. He wanted to generate the fixed air on demand in a controlled environment far away from the smell of rotting grain. To do this, he turned to a much more aggressive form of chemistry. He turned to the apothecary's shelf. He traded the biological process of fermentation for a violent chemical reaction. The ingredients he chose were simple, cheap, and readily available, but they were also significantly more dangerous than beer foam. The first ingredient was chalk, just common calcium carbonate. It was dry, dusty, and white. You could find it in the cliffs of Dover or on a school slate. It felt harmless in the hand, a soft, crumbling stone that left a ghost of white powder on your fingertips. But inside that chalk was a massive reservoir of carbon dioxide, locked away in the rock, waiting for a key to turn the lock. The key was the second ingredient. In the 18th century, they called it oil of vitriol. The name alone sounds like a weapon. Today, we know it as sulfuric acid. It is a thick, syrupy liquid that looks deceptively like water, but it moves with a heavy, oily viscosity. It is highly corrosive. If you spill a drop on wood, it turns black instantly. If you spill it on your skin, it does the same. It burns through fabric, leather, and flesh with a terrifying, silent efficiency. The process of making soda water had now become a survival challenge. The chemist would take a glass vessel, a flask with a narrow neck, and fill the bottom with the crushed white chalk. Then, with a steady hand, he would pour the oil of vitriol over the stones. The reaction is immediate and violent. It is not a gentle fizz, it is a chemical argument. The acid attacks the chalk, dissolving the calcium and liberating the gas in a sudden, hot rush. The flask heats up in your hand. The mixture froths and churns, turning into a milky, bubbling sludge. A thick, white fog rises up the neck of the bottle. This is pure carbon dioxide, generated in a rush of chemical liberation. But now you have a new logistical problem. You have created the ghost, but it is angry, and it is trying to escape. You need to catch it. In the modern world, we use stainless steel pipes and rubber hoses. In the 1770s, they used what they had. They used biology. To pipe the gas from the generating flask to the water vessel, Priestley and his contemporaries often used a bladder, specifically the bladder of a pig or a cow. It was soft, pliable, and airtight. Imagine the sensory reality of this apparatus. You are in a dim laboratory, smelling the sharp, acrid tang of sulfuric acid. You are holding a glass flask that is hot to the touch, and attached to the neck of that flask is a wet, limp animal organ, slowly inflating like a grotesque balloon as the gas rushes into it. The bladder acted as a reservoir. Once it was full of fixed air, the chemist would squeeze it, forcing the gas through a leather pipe and into a second vessel filled with pure water. He would have to agitate the water, shake the bottle, to get the gas to dissolve. It was a rhythmic, physical labor. Squeeze the bladder, shake the bottle, squeeze, shake, all while hoping the acid in the first flask didn't boil over. And that was the real danger. The bad news is that this system was imperfect. If the reaction was too violent, or if the pipe was too short, a spray of sulfuric acid would travel with the gas. It would bypass the bladder and end up in your drinking water. This happened more often than you might think. The resulting soda water would sparkle, yes, it would have the bubbles, but it would also have a taint. It would taste sharp, biting, and metallic. It would burn the back of the throat, not with the pleasant prickle of carbonation, but with the actual chemical burn of vitriol. Drinking a glass of soda in 1780 was a game of roulette. You were betting that the chemist had scrubbed the gas properly. You were betting that you were drinking a mineral tonic and not a diluted cup of battery acid. This was the state of the art. It was a messy, smelly, and dangerous process that produced a drink that was often barely potable. It was a miracle of science, but it was a failure of engineering. You could make a glass for yourself, if you were brave, but you could not make 1,000 glasses for the public. To take this grim experiment and turn it into an industry, someone had to figure out how to scale up the violence without killing the customer. The bladder had to go. The handshaking had to stop. The world was waiting for a machine that could handle the pressure. We are moving from the chaotic, acid-stained laboratory of the alchemist to the orderly workshop of the engineer. The year is 1783. We are in Geneva, Switzerland. The man who will finally solve the problem of the bladder and the bucket is not a chemist by trade. He is a watchmaker. His name is Johann Jacob Schwepp. A watchmaker understands something that a chemist often ignores: precision and pressure. Schweppe looked at Priestley's passive bowls of water and realized that the problem was not the gas itself. The problem was the delivery system. You cannot politely ask carbon dioxide to dissolve into water. You have to force it. You have to coerce it. And to do that, you do not need a bladder. You need a machine. Schweppe took the violent chemistry of the chalk and acid reaction and enclosed it in a system of heavy wooden casks and brass fittings. He called it the Geneva system. It was the first true industrial apparatus for making soda. But do not imagine a sleek, humming factory floor. Imagine a dark, cramped room filled with the sound of rhythmic grinding. The heart of the Geneva system was not the chemical flask, but the compression pump. Schweppe realized that if you increased the pressure inside the vessel, the water would accept more gas. It is a simple principle of physics, but in 1783, it was a logistical nightmare. To generate that pressure, you needed force, and the only force available was human muscle. Picture the logistical reality of this early factory. A workman stands next to a large wooden tub reinforced with iron bands. Protruding from the side is a heavy iron crank. His job is to turn it. It is not a smooth motion. As the pressure builds inside the vessel, the resistance grows. The gas pushes back. The water pushes back. The crank becomes harder and harder to turn. The room is silent, except for the groaning of the wood and the heavy breathing of the operator. It is a rhythm of pure friction, round and round, hour after hour, fighting the invisible expansion of the gas. The friction generates heat, so the machine has to be constantly cooled, or the gas will expand too much and blow the seals. It is a delicate, sweating balance between the strength of the man's arm and the structural integrity of the barrel. This was the birth of the soda industry. It was not built on magic. It was built on the sore shoulders of anonymous workmen turning a handle in a damp room. But the result of this aggression was undeniable. When you opened the tap on Schwepp's machine, the water that came out was different. It was not the weak, slightly sour water of Priestley's brewery experiment. This water was angry. It was saturated. The bubbles were small, sharp, and aggressive. Because they had been forced into the liquid under immense pressure, they exploded on the tongue with a violence that no natural spring could match. It had a bite. It was crisp. It was the first time in history that a human being had tasted highly carbonated water. It was a sensory shock. Schwepp knew he had something valuable. He moved his operation to London in 1792, setting up shop on Drury Lane. But he did not market this drink as a fun, sugary treat for children. That concept did not exist yet. He marketed it as artificial mineral water. It was medicine. It was sold to the wealthy, the gout-ridden, and the dyspeptic elite of London society. The marketing was brilliant. He claimed that his machine-made water was actually superior to the natural springs because he could control the dosage. He could guarantee the spirit in every glass. Doctors began to prescribe it. It became a status symbol to have a bottle of Schwepp's water on your table. It meant you could afford the technology. But there was a flaw in the Geneva system. a flaw that would plague the industry for the next 100 years. Making the water fizzy was one thing, keeping it fizzy was another. You could use the hand crank to force the gas into the water inside the machine, but the moment you try to move that water into a bottle for delivery, the gas tried to escape. It is the nature of fixed air to be fugitive. It wants to return to the atmosphere. As soon as the pressure was released to fill a bottle, the water would go flat. Schweppe had to design a way to bottle under pressure, an industrial feat that required speed and a perfect seal. He used earthenware stone bottles at first because they were cheap and strong. But earthenware is porous. The gas would slowly seep through the microscopic holes in the clay. A customer would buy a bottle of this expensive medical miracle, take it home and uncork it days later, only to find dead, flat water. The spirit had walked through the walls. To solve this, the industry had to move to a material that was completely airtight. They had to move to glass. And that is where the real danger began. Because unlike clay, glass does not breathe. And unlike wood, glass does not groan before it fails. It simply shatters. The solution to the gas escaping through the clay was, in theory, simple. If the spirit could walk through the walls of an earthenware jug, then you had to build walls it could not penetrate. You had to use glass. Glass is non-porous. It is chemically inert. It does not impart a flavor to the water, and it does not allow the carbon dioxide to slip away into the atmosphere. It seemed like the perfect vessel for the new industry. But there was a logistical reality that the early soda pioneers had overlooked. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, glass manufacturing was not a science of precision. It was a craft of lung power and guesswork. Bottles were not stamped out by hydraulic machines in sterile factories. They were blown by hand, one at a time, by men standing in front of roaring furnaces. Because they were handmade, no two bottles were exactly alike. One might be thick and sturdy on one side, but dangerously thin on the other. The glass itself was often green, not just in color, but in quality. It was filled with microscopic imperfections, tiny bubbles of air, known as seeds, or small, unmelted stones, were trapped within the walls of the vessel. In a wine bottle or a jar of preserves, these flaws were merely cosmetic. They were signs of the artisan's hand. But soda water is not wine. Wine sits still. Soda water is trying to expand. When you force carbon dioxide into water, you are creating a pressurized environment. The gas is desperate to return to its gaseous state. It pushes against the inside of the bottle with a force of roughly 60 pounds per square inch. It seeks out the weakness. It finds the microscopic bubble in the glass, the thin spot near the neck, or the stress line from where the glass cooled too quickly, and it pushes. This turned the back room of the Victorian pharmacy into a very specific kind of hell. Imagine you are a clerk working in the storage cellar of a busy apothecary. It is cool and dark down there. The shelves are lined with hundreds of glass bottles, each one corked and wired shut, filled with the latest batch of aerated water. You are sweeping the floor, or perhaps taking inventory. It is quiet, and then, without warning, crack. It is not the sound of a cork popping, it is the sharp, violent sound of glass failing under tension. A bottle has just exploded. It hasn't simply broken, it has detonated. The internal pressure has blown the glass outward with enough force to embed shards in the wooden shelving across the aisle. This was known as the spontaneous burst. It happened constantly. In the warm summer months, when the heat caused the gas to expand even further, the rate of failure would skyrocket. A pharmacy could lose 10, 15, or even 20% of its inventory before a single bottle was sold. Think about that logistical reality for a moment. Imagine a modern business where 20% of your product simply destroys itself while sitting on the shelf. It was a staggering economic loss. The floor of the storage room would be perpetually sticky, slick with the sugar and water of the wasted tonic. The air would smell of stale, drying syrup and the metallic tang of the mineral water. But the financial loss was secondary to the physical danger. These bottles were, for all intents and purposes, glass grenades. When they blew, they did not care who was standing next to them. A shard of thick, jagged glass flying at high velocity is a lethal projectile. Pharmacists and their apprentices learned to move through the storage rooms with a specific kind of dread. You did not handle the bottles roughly. You did not knock them together. You treated them with the same respect you would treat a loaded weapon. There are accounts of clerks being blinded by flying glass. There are stories of deep lacerations that severed tendons in the hands and wrists. The simple act of retrieving a bottle of soda for a customer was a risk assessment. You were walking into a minefield of your own making. The loss rate was not just a line on a ledger. It was a measure of how much glass you had to sweep up at the end of the day. The industry had created a product that the public craved, but they had packaged it in a vessel that could not contain it. The chemistry was ahead of the metallurgy, the ambition was ahead of the engineering, and until the glass blowers could figure out how to temper their product, the men who sold soda had to accept that their inventory was going to try to kill them. Eventually, the danger became so acute that the workers refused to go into the bottling rooms without protection. They could not fix the glass, so they had to fix themselves. They had to armor up. If you were to walk into a bottling plant in London, New York, or Paris in the mid-19th century, you would be forgiven for thinking you had stumbled into a medieval armory. You would not see men in clean white coats. You would not see the sterile, stainless steel environment of modern food production. Instead, you would see rows of men standing in the dim light, wearing iron cages over their heads. These were known as bottling masks. They looked remarkably like the masks used in the sport of fencing, constructed of heavy, rusted wire mesh that covered the entire face and neck. They were not a fashion statement. They were a necessity. The men wore them because the bottle in their hand was not a beverage container. It was a pressurized bomb waiting for an excuse to detonate. Alongside the masks, the workers wore thick, stiff leather gauntlets that reached up to their elbows. They wore heavy aprons made of cured hide, often stained dark with syrup and oil. They looked like blacksmiths preparing for war, but their enemy was a 6-ounce glass bottle of ginger ale. The atmosphere in these factories was one of constant, rhythmic tension. The air would have been hot, humid, and thick with the smell of machine oil, wet sawdust, and the sharp, metallic tang of carbonic acid. Underneath that, there was the smell of the workers themselves, sweat trapped inside heavy leather on a 12-hour shift. The job was repetitive, but it required the nerves of a bomb disposal expert. A worker would take a bottle, place it under the spigot of the filling machine, and pull a lever. The machine would force the carbonated water into the glass at a pressure of roughly 60 to 70 pounds per square inch. This was the moment of truth. As the gas rushed in, the glass would expand. If there was a microscopic flaw, a tiny air bubble in the glass wall, a hairline fracture from the annealing oven, or a thin spot in the neck, the bottle would fail. It did not just crack, it exploded. The internal pressure would blow the glass outward at a velocity sufficient to sever a tendon or blind a man instantly. The wire mesh of the mask was there to catch the shrapnel before it embedded itself in the worker's eyes. The leather gauntlets were there to protect the arteries and the wrists from being sliced open by flying, jagged shards. Listen to the sound of this room. It is a mechanical rhythm. Clink, the bottle hits the metal plate. Hiss, the gas rushes in. Thump, the cork is driven home. Clink, hiss, thump. And then, unpredictably, a violent pop, followed by the distinct, musical tinkle of falling glass. When a bottle burst, nobody screamed, nobody stopped the line. The worker would simply brush the shards off his leather apron, kick the larger pieces into the sawdust on the floor, and reach for the next bottle. It was a grim calculation. The loss of the bottle was deducted from the factory's profits. The loss of a worker's eye was considered a hazard of the trade. The floor of the bottling plant was a treacherous landscape. It was slick with the mixture of spilled soda water and machine grease. The sawdust used to soak up the mess would turn into a sticky, sweet sludge that clung to the workers' boots. In the summer, the sweetness attracted swarms of flies and wasps, adding another layer of misery to the heat and the danger. There is a profound disconnect here that is worth considering. The product being made in this dangerous, dirty, and violent room was the height of elegance. The soda water was destined for the tables of the aristocracy. It was going to be poured into crystal goblets in parlors and high-end hotels. The consumer, sipping their cool, refreshing tonic, had absolutely no idea that the bubbles in their glass had been wrestled into submission by a man wearing a fencing mask. They did not know that the sparkle they enjoyed was the result of a dangerous industrial process that treated glass like a grenade and workers like cannon fodder. The survival of the bottler was of no concern to the drinker. The only thing that mattered was the fizz. But the industry knew that this could not last. The loss rate, both of bottles and of workers, was simply too high. You cannot build a global empire if 10% of your product explodes before it leaves the factory. The masks and the gloves were a temporary solution to a structural problem. The cork was the enemy. Driving a cork into a pressurized bottle required force, and force created stress. They needed a way to seal the bottle that didn't require a hammer. They needed a closure that used the pressure of the gas to help the seal rather than fight against it. They needed to stop fighting the physics of carbonation and start using them. The solution, when it finally arrived, would come in the form of a child's toy. The solution to the exploding bottle did not come from a chemist. It came from a salesman who understood that you cannot fight the gas. You have to let the gas do the work for you. In 1872, a man named Hiram Codd patented a bottle that would change the sound of the world. It was a design so strange, so alien to modern eyes, that if you found one buried in a garden today, you might think it was a piece of laboratory equipment or a relic from a lost civilization. This was the Codd neck bottle. It was made of extremely thick, heavy glass that was designed to survive the war against pressure. But the genius was not in the thickness of the walls, it was in the neck. Inside the chamber of the bottle, trapped like a ship in a bottle, was a glass marble. There was no cork, there was no screw cap, there was just this marble and a small ring of vulcanized rubber sitting inside the lip of the bottle. The mechanism was a stroke of engineering brilliance. When the bottle was filled with carbonated water, it was filled upside down. The pressure of the gas, the same force that had been shattering bottles and blinding workers for 50 years, now pushed the marble up against the rubber ring. The stronger the gas, the tighter the seal. The very thing that tried to escape was now the thing keeping the door locked. It was a perfect, self-regulating system. The spirit was no longer a fugitive, it was a jailer. Holding a Codd bottle in your hand is a distinct sensory experience. It is heavy. It feels like a weapon. The glass is often a pale, aquatic green, thick enough to distort the light passing through it. When you walk with it, it makes a sound. Clink, clunk, clink, clunk. The marble rattles inside the chamber, knocking against the glass walls. It is the sound of a childhood in the Victorian era. Opening it required a specific ritual. You could not just twist a cap. You had to defeat the pressure. You would take a wooden plunger, or, if you were a rougher sort, your own thumb, and place it on the marble at the top of the neck. You would push down hard. Pop. The marble would be forced down into the wider chamber of the neck, releasing a sudden, sharp hiss of gas. The marble would fall into the liquid with a satisfying rattle. The drink was now open, but the relationship between the drinker and the marble was not over. Designing a bottle with a loose glass sphere inside creates a new logistical problem. How do you drink without the marble rolling back up and plugging the hole? If you tilted the bottle up to take a swig, the marble would naturally fall back into the neck and stop the flow. It was a built-in frustration. To solve this, Cod designed two small indentations, or lugs, in the glass neck. You had to learn the technique. You had to hold the bottle in a specific way, catching the marble in these glass dimples so the liquid could flow past it. Drinking a soda in 1875 was a skill. It required dexterity. But there was a darker, grimier side to this invention. The Cod bottle was a marvel of engineering, but it was a disaster of hygiene. Think about the mechanics of the seal. The marble sat at the very top of the neck, pressed against the rubber washer. It formed a small, cup-like depression at the mouth of the bottle. This depression was a magnet for the filth of the 19th century street. Dust from the unpaved roads, soot from the coal fires, and dirt from the hands of the delivery boys would settle into the lip of the bottle, right on top of the marble. It formed a ring of black grime. When you opened the bottle, when you pushed that marble down, you were effectively pushing the stopper through the dirt and dropping it directly into your drink. The first sip of a cod-neck soda often tasted of the city itself. It was a gritty, earthy introduction to the sweet tonic below. And then there was the problem of the marble itself. To a child in the 1880s, a glass marble was a currency. It was a toy, a treasure, and a gambling chip. And here was a bottle that contained a perfect, beautiful sphere of glass, trapped behind a wall of green silica. The bottle was property of the soda company, meant to be returned, washed, and refilled. But to the street urchins of London and New York, it was a bank vault waiting to be cracked. They did not have the tools to extract the marble gently, so they used the only method they knew. They smashed the bottles. Thousands upon thousands of cod bottles were destroyed by children seeking the prize inside. They would crack the necks against curbs or hit them with stones, shattering the thick glass to liberate the marble. The logistical reality for the soda companies was a nightmare. They had solved the problem of the gas escaping, only to create a new problem of the bottles being murdered for their internal organs. The sound of the factory had changed from the pop of exploding glass to the smash of vandalism in the alleyways. The industry was bleeding inventory, one marble at a time. They needed a way to make the drink cold enough that the customer wouldn't care about the grit, and cheap enough that the bottle didn't matter. They needed ice, and to get it, they would have to go to the end of the world. There was a fundamental flaw in the Victorian soda experience, one that no amount of marble stoppers or high-pressure bottling could solve. The drink was warm. In the 19th century, if you were drinking a mineral tonic in July, you were drinking it at the ambient temperature of the room. And warm carbonated water does not taste like a treat. It tastes like medicine. It is flat, cloying, and emphasizes the metallic tang of the minerals. To transform this gritty, medicinal sludge into a luxury, the industry needed something that did not exist in the summer. They needed winter. To find it, we must leave the humid, dangerous bottling plants of London and New York. We must travel north to the frozen lakes of Massachusetts in the dead of January. The year is 1806. The air here is sharp enough to hurt your lungs. It is a landscape of absolute silence, a white, flat expanse of ice that stretches for miles. But if you listen closely, you can hear a sound that defined an era. It is the rhythmic, grinding rasp of metal biting into frozen water. This is the domain of Frederick Tudor, a man who would come to be known as the Ice King. Tudor was a Boston businessman with an idea so audacious that his contemporaries thought he had lost his mind. He looked at the frozen ponds of New England at the ice that clogged the harbours and froze the ground, and he did not see a nuisance. He saw a crop. He realized that the only difference between a worthless sheet of ice in Boston and a diamond-priced luxury in the Caribbean was geography. All he had to do was move the winter to the summer. But harvesting winter is a brutal logistical reality. Picture the scene on the pond. It is not a romantic image of skaters gliding on the surface. It is an industrial slaughterhouse for water. Dozens of men and horses are out on the ice. The horses are wearing special shoes fitted with sharp iron spikes to keep them from slipping. They are pulling a heavy iron device known as an ice plow. The plow cuts deep, parallel grooves into the surface of the lake, marking out a perfect grid. The sound is deafening, a high-pitched screech of metal on crystal. Once the grid is cut, the men move in with massive hand saws. These are not carpenter's saws. They are 4 feet long, with teeth the size of a man's thumb. The labour is back-breaking. The men have to saw through nearly 2 feet of solid ice, standing on a slippery, freezing surface that could crack at any moment. If a man slips and falls into the black water below, he has minutes before his muscles seize and he drowns under the ceiling of the ice. It was a harvest of high stakes. Once the blocks were cut, massive 300-pound cubes of blue ice, clear and dense, they had to be floated down a channel of open water to the shore. There, they were hauled up ramps by straining teams of horses, steam rising from their flanks in the frigid air. The sheer weight of the product was the first logistical nightmare. Ice is heavy. It is dead weight, and unlike timber or stone, it is a ticking clock. From the moment the ice is cut, it is dying. It is melting. Tudor was fighting a war against thermodynamics. Every second that the block sat on the dock, every minute it spent in the wagon, he was losing inventory. To combat this, he built massive, windowless ice houses on the shores of the lakes. These were double-walled tombs for the cold. The space between the walls was packed with insulating materials, tan bark, charcoal, and most importantly, sawdust. The blocks were stacked tightly together to minimize the surface area exposed to the air. In the dark, freezing silence of the ice house, the winter could be preserved. Tudor's business model was slippery speculation, as his critics called it. He was betting his entire fortune on the idea that he could take a product that naturally destroys itself and ship it to the hottest places on Earth. He was not just selling ice, he was selling the conquest of nature. He was promising that a man in Havana or Calcutta could hold a piece of a Massachusetts winter in his glass. But the harvest was only the beginning. The ice was safe in the dark house on the shore. Now, he had to get it onto a ship. He had to move it from the freezing air of New England across the equator and into the tropics, and he had to do it before the product vanished into a puddle of expensive water. The saw was silent. The race against the sun was about to begin. Once the ice was cut from the frozen skin of the New England pond, the real logistical nightmare began. It is one thing to keep a block of ice frozen in a Massachusetts winter. It is entirely another to keep it frozen in the hull of a wooden ship sailing across the equator. Frederick Tudor knew that he was not just shipping a commodity, he was shipping a melting clock. Every hour the ship sat at the dock, his profit was turning into water and draining into the harbour. To combat the heat, Tudor created what became known as the sawdust fleet. He realized that the enemy was not just the sun, but the air itself. He needed a thermal barrier so dense that the tropical humidity could not penetrate it. He found his answer in the waste products of the lumber industry. The hold of an ice ship was a masterpiece of crude insulation. The workers would build a false floor and false walls inside the hull, creating a gap of about a foot between the ice and the wood of the ship. Into this gap, they poured tons of dry, white pine sawdust. They packed it tight, stomping it down until it formed a solid, airless wall. They used hay, tan bark, and even dried peat moss. But sawdust was the king. It was cheap, it was light, and it trapped dead air better than almost anything else available in the 19th century. The blocks of ice were stacked with mathematical precision. They were not thrown in randomly. They were fitted together like the stones of a pyramid, creating a single, massive monolith of cold. The theory was simple. A large mass melts slower than a small one. If you could turn 10,000 individual blocks into one giant glacier inside the ship, the center would remain frozen, even if the edges wept. Imagine the sensory reality of standing in that hold as the ship crossed the equator. Above deck, the sun is beating down on the tarred planks. The air temperature is nearing 100 degrees. The sailors are sweating through their shirts, and the pitch in the deck seams is bubbling. But down here, in the dark, it is freezing. The air in the hold is heavy and damp. It smells of wet pine, resin, and the musty, organic scent of wet straw. It is a confused atmosphere. You are floating on a tropical ocean, yet your breath is misting in front of your face. You can hear the groaning of the ship's timbers as they expand and contract in the heat. But the ice sits silent, a cold, white tomb in the belly of the vessel. But the insulation was never perfect. The shrinkage was a grim certainty. On a voyage to India, which could take 4 months, a ship might lose half of its cargo. The bilge pumps had to run constantly, not to pump out seawater, but to pump out the melted profits. The sailors could tell how much money was being lost by the sound of the water gushing from the scuppers. It was a race to get to ports before the ship arrived empty. When a ship finally docked in Calcutta in 1833, the arrival was treated as a miracle. You must understand the context. For a British colonial officer or a wealthy Indian merchant living in the suffocating heat of Bengal, ice was a theoretical concept. They had read about it in books. They remembered it from childhoods in England. But to see it here, in the tropics, was like seeing a ghost. The labourers who unloaded the ships had to be paid extra. They were terrified of the blocks. When they touched the ice, the sensation was so intense, so alien to their experience of the climate, that they believed they had been burned. They dropped the blocks, thinking they were holding white hot metal. The cold was so aggressive, it registered as heat. But for the wealthy, it was a revelation. The ice was carted off to private godowns, stone warehouses lined with straw, where it was hoarded like gold. And this is where the history of soda pivots. Before the arrival of the sawdust fleet, carbonated water was drunk at room temperature. It was a tepid, medicinal experience. The bubbles were aggressive, and the mineral taste was forward. But when you poured that same drink over a jagged lump of Wenham Lake ice, the chemistry changed. Cold suppresses sweetness, but it also suppresses bitterness. It numbs the tongue just enough to take the edge off the carbonic acid. The drink became crisp. It became refreshing. The clink of the ice against the glass became the sound of luxury. It was the auditory signal that you had conquered the climate. Suddenly, the soda was not just for the gout-ridden invalid, it was for the overheated socialite. The ice trade did not just cool the drink, it expanded the market. It turned a medical necessity into a recreational pleasure. But there was still a problem. Even with the ice, the drink itself, the water, the gas, the minerals, still tasted like licking a battery. To make it truly popular, to sell it to the masses who couldn't afford a block of Boston ice, they needed to mask the taste. They needed to hide the medicine behind a wall of flavour, and to do that, they would have to boil some roots. Now that we have cooled the water with the frozen harvest of a New England winter, we must address the liquid itself. We have the bubbles, the violent metallic gas captured from the chalk. We have the ice, the numbing cold that suppresses the bite of the carbonic acid. But we are still missing the soul of the drink. We are missing the flavour. To find it, we must leave the bright, sterile front of the Victorian pharmacy with its polished mahogany counters and coloured glass jars. We must push through the heavy velvet curtain and step into the back room. This is the domain of the syrup room, or more accurately, the kitchen of the chemist. The air here is thick. It is heavy with humidity and heat. It does not smell like the crisp, clean scent of the ice house. It smells of wet earth. It smells of roots. In the 19th century, before the invention of artificial fruit flavors and synthesized esters, the flavor of soda came from the ground. It came from the bark of trees, the roots of weeds, and the rhizomes of strange, tropical vines. The pharmacist was not a chef, he was an extractor. His goal was to take these hard, fibrous materials and boil them until they surrendered their essence. Look at the ingredients piled on the work table. They do not look like food. They look like yard waste. There is a heap of sarsaparilla root. It looks like a tangle of dead brown wire. It is tough, woody, and covered in a fine layer of dirt. Next to it is a stack of birch bark, peeled from the tree in rough, papery strips. There are knobs of ginger, looking like gnarled fingers, and piles of dandelion root dug up from the fields that morning. The process of turning this wood pile into a drink was not delicate. It was a brutal act of reduction. The pharmacist would take these roots and chop them into small pieces using a heavy iron cleaver. The sound of the room was the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of metal hitting wood. He would then dump this woody shrapnel into a massive copper kettle filled with water, and then he would boil it. This was not a quick simmer. This was a long, slow, aggressive extraction. The mixture would boil for hours, filling the room with a dense, fragrant steam. If you were to stand over that kettle and breathe in, the smell would be overwhelming. It was a complex, medicinal fog. The sarsaparilla released a scent that was earthy and sweet, reminiscent of vanilla and caramel, but with a dark, licorice-like undertone. The birch bark added a sharp, piercing note of wintergreen, a cold smell that cut through the humidity. The ginger added heat. The dandelion added a deep, bitter bass note. As the water evaporated, the liquid in the kettle would darken. It would turn from a pale tea color to a deep, opaque brown, and finally to a black, viscous sludge. This was the extract. It was a concentration of every chemical compound found in the plant. It was thick, sticky, and incredibly potent. If you were to dip a spoon into this sludge and taste it, you would not smile. It was intensely bitter. It was astringent. It would dry out your mouth and make your tongue feel like felt. It tasted of tannin and earth. It was, in a word, inedible. But that was the point. You see, in the 19th century, you did not drink soda because you were thirsty. You drank it because you were dying. Or at least, because you thought you were. These syrups were not marketed as treats. They were marketed as blood purifiers, nerve tonics, and stomach elixirs. The prevailing medical theory of the time was that sickness was caused by impure blood or a sluggish liver. The bitterness of the roots was the proof of their potency. If it tasted good, it was just food. If it tasted like wet bark and iron, it was medicine. The customer wanted that earthy, challenging flavor profile because it reassured them that the tonic was doing its job. The pharmacist would take this thick, black tar and store it in stoneware jugs. This was the base of the root beer, the birch beer, and the sarsaparilla that would eventually conquer the world. It was a grim, dark liquid born of fire and wood, but there was a limit to how much bitterness the public could tolerate. Even the most hypochondriac Victorian could not drink straight root extract. To make this medicine go down, to transform the sludge into a soda, the pharmacist needed a carrier. He needed a medium that could dilute the bitterness and make the bubbles dance. He needed a sweetener. But just like the ice in the glass, The sugar of the 1800s was a logistical nightmare all its own. To understand the sweetness of the past, you must first forget the white, granular sand that sits in your kitchen cabinet today. In the 19th century, sugar was not a powder, it was a rock. It was a structural element. If you walked into the pantry of a Victorian pharmacy or a wealthy home, you would not find a bag of sugar, you would find a loaf. This was known as the sugar loaf. It was a solid, cone-shaped tower of crystallized sucrose, standing anywhere from 8 inches to 3 feet tall. It looked like a white or light brown mountain, often wrapped in indigo blue paper to make the sugar look whiter by contrast. It was dense, heavy, and incredibly hard. You could not pour it, you could not spoon it. If you wanted to sweeten a drink, you had to attack the loaf with a weapon. The tool of choice was a pair of sugar nippers. These were heavy, iron pliers with sharp, beak-like jaws. They looked less like a kitchen utensil and more like something a blacksmith would use to pull a nail out of a horse's hoof. The logistical reality of making syrup began with the sound of metal on stone. The pharmacist, or his apprentice, would have to hold the heavy loaf in one hand and the iron nippers in the other. They would clamp the jaws onto the edge of the cone and squeeze. It required significant hand strength. The iron would bite into the crystal structure, and with a sharp snap, a chunk of sugar would fly off. It was a violent, percussive process. Snap, crack, clink. These chunks were not uniform. They were jagged, irregular shards of varying sizes. Some were the size of a walnut, others were merely dust. To make a consistent syrup, you had to weigh these shards on a brass scale, balancing the jagged rocks against the counterweights until you had the precise amount required for the batch. But the violence of the nippers was only the first step. The sugar itself was rarely pure. In the mid-19th century, the refining process was imperfect. The loaf was often muscovado, or semi-refined. It was not the stark, sterile white of modern chemical processing. It was often a creamy off-white or a light brown, and it was sticky. It smelled faintly of molasses, of the ship's hold, and of the tropical refinery where it had been boiled down from cane juice. When you dropped these hard shards into the hot water to make your simple syrup, you were not just dissolving sugar, you were releasing everything that had been trapped inside the loaf. As the water simmered and the crystals broke down, a grey, frothy scum would rise to the surface of the pot. This scum was the impurities. It was a mixture of uncrystallized molasses, dirt from the drying floor, fibers from the cane, and sometimes the remnants of the insects that had been attracted to the sweet cone during its long journey across the ocean. The pharmacist had to stand over the kettle with a slotted spoon, skimming this grey foam off the top of the bubbling syrup. It was a process of clarification. You boiled, you skimmed, and you repeated until the liquid was relatively clear. The result was not the invisible, neutral sweetness of high fructose corn syrup. It was a heavy, amber-coloured liquid with a distinct flavour profile. It tasted cooked. It had depth. When mixed with the bitter root sludge of the sarsaparilla or the birch bark, it provided a rich caramel backbone that stood up to the earthiness of the herbs. It was a sweetness with weight. And it came at a price. In the 1800s, sugar was expensive. It was a heavily taxed import, a white gold that drove colonial economies and trade wars. To use this much sugar, to boil down pounds of hard, expensive loaves into a syrup just to flavour a drink, was an act of luxury. It meant that the resulting soda was not a cheap commodity. It was a treat. It was something you savoured because you knew, consciously or not, the labour and the cost that had gone into the glass. The syrup was now ready. It was dark, bitter with roots, and thick with expensive hand-nipped sugar. But the recipe was not finished. The drink was sweet, yes. It was cold, thanks to the ice. But it was missing a critical dimension. It lacked the sharpness that would wake up the stomach. It needed a bite. To finish the formula, the apothecary had to reach for the most dangerous bottle on the shelf, the bottle marked bitters. We have the bubbles, violent and sharp. We have the ice, harvested from a frozen pond to numb the tongue. And we have the syrup, a thick, cooked reduction of roots and hand-nipped sugar. But if you were to stop there, you would have a beverage that was merely pleasant. And in the 19th century pharmacy, pleasant was not a selling point. Pleasant did not cure you. To transform a sweet drink into a medical necessity, the apothecary had to reach for a different row of bottles. These were usually small, dark glass vials kept behind the counter, away from the light. They contained the bitters. The concept of the stomach cure was central to Victorian health. The prevailing medical theory was that the stomach was a lazy organ. It was prone to atony, or a lack of muscle tension. Digestion was viewed as a mechanical labor that the body often shirked. To fix a sluggish digestion, you did not soothe it, you shocked it. You had to wake the stomach up, and the alarm clock was bitterness. The ingredients used to achieve this shock were aggressive. The most common was gentian root. If you have never seen it, gentian looks like a fossilized finger, wrinkled, brown, and hard as stone. When ground into a powder, it releases a dust that tastes intensely, unrelentingly bitter. It is not the bitterness of dark chocolate or coffee. It is a pure, chemical bitterness that hits the back of the throat and stays there. Then there was wormwood, the infamous herb that gives absinthe its reputation. It is a dusty, gray-green plant with a scent that is both herbal and slightly metallic. It was believed to kill parasites, hence the name, but in a tonic, it was used to stimulate the appetite. The theory was simple. If you put something this foul into your mouth, your body would produce saliva and gastric juices in a desperate attempt to wash it away. You were tricking your body into digestion through a mild form of poisoning. But the king of the bitters was cinchona bark. This was the Jesuit's bark, imported from the high Andes of Peru. It was a reddish, fibrous wood that, when pulverized, created a powder so acrid it could make a grown man gag. But it contained a miracle: quinine. Quinine was the only known defense against malaria, the fever that was decimating populations in the American South and the British colonies in India. It was a survival essential. But the logistical reality of quinine is that it is unpalatable. It is violently astringent. It dries the mouth instantly, sucking the moisture out of the tongue and leaving a taste that feels like copper pennies. This created a dilemma for the pharmacist. He had a medicine that everyone needed, but no one wanted to take. The solution was the spoonful of sugar approach, scaled up to industrial levels. The pharmacist began to experiment. He took the bitter extract of the cinchona, or the gentian, and mixed it with the heavy, cooked sugar syrup we discussed earlier. He added the aromatics, vanilla bean, wintergreen oil, cinnamon, and nutmeg to confuse the nose. And finally, he diluted the whole thing with the carbonated water from his machine. The bubbles helped lift the aromatics to the nose. The cold of the ice numbed the taste buds against the bitterness. The sugar coated the throat, and the result was tonic water. It was a balancing act. The drink had to be bitter enough to prove it was medicine, but sweet enough to be swallowed without retching. This is how the flavor profile of modern soda was born. It was not designed by a chef trying to create a treat. It was designed by a chemist trying to hide a flavor. Eventually, the public began to acquire a taste for the mask itself. They learned to enjoy the dry finish of the quinine and the earthy depth of the roots. They began to drink the cures even when they weren't sick. The stomach tonic moved from the medicine cabinet to the soda fountain. But while the bitters could wake up the stomach, they couldn't wake up the mind. For that, the industry needed a stimulant that went straight to the brain. They needed a nut from Africa. The stomach was awake, but the mind was still tired. The bitters could make you hungry, but they couldn't make you work faster. For that, the apothecary needed a stimulant. He needed something stronger than tea and cheaper than opium. He needed a nut that grew 4,000 miles away in the upper canopy of the West African rainforest. This brings us to the Cola acuminata, the cola nut. To understand the supply chain reality of this ingredient, you have to leave the brick streets of London and Atlanta. You have to stand at the base of a tree in the humid, filtering light of the Gold Coast, what we now know as Ghana, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. The cola tree is not a shrub, it is a giant. It grows up to 60 feet tall, with a smooth grey trunk and glossy leaves that trap the heavy tropical moisture. The nuts do not fall politely to the ground like acorns. They grow in heavy, star-shaped pods, high in the branches, hidden among the leaves. To harvest them, a man has to climb. There were no safety harnesses in the 19th century. There were no hydraulic lifts. There was only skin against bark. The harvester would have to scale the trunk, pulling himself up into the canopy, navigating a vertical maze of branches that were often slick with moss and rain. He carried a long pole with a curved knife at the end, or sometimes just a machete. He was not alone in the tree. The canopy is an ecosystem. It is filled with weaving ants, red, biting insects that build nests in the leaves. It is home to snakes and spiders. The harvester had to balance 60 feet in the air, fighting off insects while hacking at the tough, fibrous stems of the pods. When a pod was cut, it would plummet to the forest floor with a heavy thud. Inside the thick green husk lay the prize, a cluster of nuts, usually white or bright pink when fresh. They looked like fleshy, organic stones, but the moment they were exposed to the air, they began to oxidize. They turned a deep, rusty brown, the color of dried blood or old iron. In West Africa, this nut was not a hidden ingredient. It was a cultural cornerstone. It was chewed socially, offered to guests as a sign of hospitality, and used in religious ceremonies. It was a symbol of friendship and ancestors. But to the Western merchant, it was just a commodity. It was a raw material. The nuts were gathered, removed from their pods, and laid out on mats to dry in the sun. This process took days. The moisture had to be evaporated until the nut was hard as a rock, durable enough to survive the long, damp voyage in the hold of a ship bound for Liverpool or New York. By the time it reached the apothecary, it was a shriveled, brown lump that rattled in the sack. If you were to take one of these dried nuts and bite into it, you would understand why it had to be hidden in a syrup. The taste is shocking. It carries a woody astringency that dries the tongue instantly, leaving a bitter, tannic coating that feels like chewing on wet bark and old oak. But if you kept chewing, the bitterness would fade, replaced by a strange, subtle sweetness. And then, the effect would hit you. The cola nut is a powerhouse of caffeine and theobromine, the same stimulant found in chocolate, but in a raw, potent form. In the 19th century, this was marketed as maintenance. It was a tool for the industrial age. It did not just wake you up, it suppressed your appetite. It allowed a laborer to work for 12 hours without feeling the gnawing pain of hunger. It allowed a clerk to stare at a ledger without his eyes closing. The apothecary saw this potential. He took the hard brown nuts and pulverized them into a powder. He boiled them, just like the roots, extracting the caffeine into a dark, bitter liquid. But the taste was still too harsh. The Victorian palate could not handle the raw power of the African forest. So, he masked it. He drowned the bitter cola extract in the heavy sugar syrup. He added the vanilla, the cinnamon, and the citrus oils. He buried the taste of the nut under layers of sweetness, leaving only the kick. The customer drank the soda and felt a surge of energy, a clarity of mind, without ever knowing they were consuming the sacred fruit of a distant rainforest. But caffeine was not enough. The public wanted more than just alertness. They wanted euphoria. They wanted a cure for the melancholy of modern life. And to give them that, the industry would have to turn to a leaf that grew even further away, in the high mountains of South America. We have the bubbles from the chalk, the cold from the ice, the sweetness from the loaf, and the wakefulness from the nut. But in the late 19th century, mere wakefulness was not enough. The industrial world was exhausting. The noise of the factories, the speed of the telegraph, and the pressure of the clock had created a new, fashionable diagnosis: neurasthenia. It was a fancy word for tired nerves. It was the burnout of the Victorian age. The symptoms were vague: fatigue, melancholy, a lack of ambition. The cure, however, was specific. The medical establishment believed that the nerves needed to be fed. They needed a tonic that didn't just wake you up, but lifted you up. They needed euphoria. To find it, the apothecary had to look beyond the African canopy. He had to look to the high, thin air of the Andes Mountains in South America. He had to look for a shrub that the Incas had called the divine plant. He had to find Erythroxylum coca, the coca leaf. Today, we associate this plant with a white, crystalline powder and the destruction of the 1980s. But in 1885, the coca leaf was not a street drug. It was a miracle of the pharmacopoeia. It was legal, it was respectable, and it was everywhere. It was in lozenges for sore throats. It was in cigarettes for asthma. And, most importantly, it was in the wine. The most famous version was Vin Mariani, a French tonic made by steeping coca leaves in Bordeaux wine. It was endorsed by popes and presidents. But in Atlanta, Georgia, a pharmacist named John Pemberton was brewing his own version. And unlike the French chemists, Pemberton was not just looking for a profit, he was looking for relief. Pemberton was a veteran of the Civil War. He carried a saber wound to the chest, and, like many veterans of his generation, he carried a heavy addiction to morphine. He was a man in constant, chronic pain. He was looking for a way to break the morphine habit, a way to cure the opium slavery that afflicted thousands of men. His solution was Pemberton's French wine coca. It was a thick, alcoholic syrup infused with the extract of the coca leaf and the extract of the cola nut. It was designed to be the ultimate nerve food. The sensory reality of this extract was distinct. If you were to taste the raw fluid extract of coca, you would notice something immediate and unsettling. It is green and herbal, tasting of tea and hay, but within seconds of it touching your tongue, the sensation changes. The bitterness disappears. The roof of your mouth goes numb. The back of your throat feels cold and anesthetized. This local anesthesia was the hallmark of the leaf. It told the drinker that the medicine was potent, but the numbness was just the delivery mechanism. Once the extract hit the bloodstream, the effect was a subtle, pervasive sense of well-being. It was not the jagged, manic energy of the modern drug. It was a smooth, confident lift. It banished fatigue. It made the world seem brighter. It made the pain of a saber wound feel distant. The dosage in these early drinks was not accidental. In the original formula for what would become Coca-Cola, the amount of cocaine was estimated to be roughly 9 milligrams per glass. To put that in perspective, a recreational dose today might be 50 to 75 milligrams. 9 milligrams is a maintenance dose. It is enough to provide a gentle lift, a slight numbing of the gums, and a distinct mood elevation. It was just enough to create a habit. But Pemberton hit a logistical wall. In 1885, Atlanta passed a local prohibition law. Alcohol was outlawed. His French wine coca, the base of his business, was suddenly illegal. He had a warehouse full of coca leaves and cola nuts, and no way to sell them. He had to pivot. He had to remove the wine. This was the moment the modern soda was born. It was not an invention of culinary genius. It was a desperate attempt to salvage a product in the face of a dry county. Pemberton took his formula and replaced the wine with the thick, sugary sludge we discussed earlier. He kept the cola nut for the caffeine. He kept the coca leaf for the lift. And to mask the bitterness of the removal of the wine, he added a complex blend of essential oils: orange, lemon, nutmeg, coriander, and cinnamon. He called it a temperance drink. It was a brilliant stroke of marketing irony. It was a non-alcoholic beverage for the sober man, yet it contained a potent stimulant and a psychoactive leaf. It was sold at the soda fountain, the moral bar, to men and women who would never dream of entering a saloon. The customer would walk up to the marble counter, feeling the weight of the day, the neurasthenia pressing on their temples. They would order a glass. The soda jerk would pump the syrup, sweet, dark, and laced with the extract, and hit it with the cold, aggressive bubbles from the carbonator. The customer would drink. The sugar provided the calories, the cola nut provided the kick, and the coca leaf provided the pause. For a nickel, you didn't just get a drink. You got a chemical reprieve from the exhaustion of the 19th century. You felt better. You felt smarter. You felt cured. And because you felt cured, you came back. You came back the next day, and the day after that. The soda habit was born not from thirst, but from the very real physiological effects of the ingredients. The pharmacy had become a dispensary for a low-grade, socially acceptable euphoria. But as the century turned, the mood began to shift. The nervous exhaustion that the coca leaf cured began to look suspiciously like a new kind of nervousness. The sober drink was creating a different kind of drunkard, and while the cocaine would eventually be scrubbed from the recipe, leaving only the flavor of the spent leaf, there was another ingredient in the pharmacy that was even heavier, a salt that didn't lift you up, but leveled you out, a mineral that came from the deep earth. The pharmacy shelves were now stocked with stimulants. You had the caffeine from the African cola nut to wake you up, and the extract of the Andean coca leaf to lift your mood. The 19th century citizen was alert, energized and vibrating with a chemically induced focus. But there is a supply chain reality to the human nervous system. What goes up must eventually come down. That familiar exhaustion wasn't just about fatigue, it was also about overexcitement, a manic energy driven by the noise of the industrial city and the very tonics people were drinking to survive it. The public didn't just need a lift, they needed ballast, they needed something to level them out. And to find that, the industry turned away from the biological world of roots and leaves and looked toward the geological world of stone. They looked for the heavy water. This brings us to the strange metallic history of the lithiated lemon-lime soda. If you travel to Douglas County, Georgia, just outside of Atlanta, you will find the site of the historic Lithia Springs. In the late 1880s, this was not a quiet suburb. It was a place of pilgrimage. The wealthy and the sick traveled for days by dusty carriage and hot soot-filled trains to reach the massive Sweetwater Park Hotel. They came for one reason: the water bubbling up from the deep bedrock. This water was different. It was not the refreshing, neutral liquid we expect today. It was mineral-rich. It was alkaline. And most importantly, it contained significant traces of lithium bicarbonate. Lithium is the third element on the periodic table. It is a soft, silvery white metal. Today, we know it as a tightly regulated psychiatric medication used to treat bipolar disorder and stabilize severe mood swings. But in the 19th century, it was simply a wellness ingredient. It was nature's way of calming the nerves. The sensory experience of drinking raw lithia water is distinct. It has a specific weight on the tongue. It feels slippery or soapy due to the alkalinity. The taste is not bad, exactly, but it is undeniably medicinal. It tastes of wet stone, of salt, and of metal. It tastes like something that has been underground for a very long time. For the Victorian hypochondriac, this taste was reassuring. It signaled potency. The medical literature of the time claimed that this water could cure a laundry list of ailments: gout, rheumatism, kidney trouble, and, most significantly, melancholia. It was the perfect counterbalance to the jittery energy of the cola drinks. If the cola was the gas pedal, the Lithia water was the brake. The obsession with this calming water became so intense that the springs could not keep up with the demand. The logistical solution, as always, was to bottle it. But plain mineral water was a hard sell to a public that had grown accustomed to the sugary, flavoured syrups of the soda fountain. The industry needed to make the metal palatable. Enter Charles Leaper Grigg. In 1929, just 2 weeks before the stock market crashed and plunged the world into the Great Depression, Grigg released a new soda. It was a citrus-flavoured beverage, heavy on the sugar to mask the bitterness of the minerals. He did not give it a catchy, snappy name. He gave it a name that sounded like a medical diagnosis. He called it Bib Label Lithiated Lemon Lime Soda. It is a mouthful. It sounds like something you would read on a prescription pad, not order at a baseball game. But the name was the marketing. The word lithiated was the hook. It told the consumer that this wasn't just a sweet, fizzy drink. It was a mood stabilizer in a bottle. The label featured a slouched figure, often interpreted as a relaxed, sedated person, the visual promise of the lithium inside. The marketing was explicit. It was sold as a cure for hangovers, which makes pharmacological sense. If you have the shakes from alcohol withdrawal, a sedative salt is a logical, if dangerous, remedy. It was sold to take the ouch out of the grouch. It was a beverage designed to chemically alter the personality of the drinker, smoothing out the rough edges of a hard day. The dosage of lithium in these early bottles was not standardized. It was a patent medicine dose, enough to claim it was there, but rarely enough to reach clinical toxicity. However, the cumulative effect of a population self-medicating with mood-stabilizing salts is a staggering concept to consider. We tend to think of the past as a simpler time, but the reality is that the average consumer in 1900 was navigating a daily cocktail of caffeine, cocaine, alcohol, and lithium, all purchased over the counter at the local pharmacy. The Bib Label Lithiated Lemon Lime Soda eventually shortened its name. It became 7-Up. The lithium was quietly removed from the formula in 1948, after the government cracked down on the use of the metal in consumer products. But for nearly 20 years, one of the most popular sodas in America was, quite literally, a psychoactive drug delivery system. The removal of the drugs, the cocaine, the lithium, the morphine, marked the end of the wild west of the soda fountain. The government was stepping in. The Pure Food and Drug Act was closing the loopholes. The era of the magic tonic was fading. But the soda fountain itself was about to undergo a transformation. It was no longer just a dispensary for medicine. It was about to become a cultural fortress. The drink had been cleaned up. Now, they had to clean up the place where you drank it. The moral bar was opening for business. To understand why the soda fountain became the dominant social architecture of the early 20th century, you have to understand what it was replacing. You have to understand the enemy. In the eyes of the temperance movement, the enemy was the saloon. The 19th century saloon was a sensory assault. It was a space designed for men, and specifically for men who wanted to disappear. The windows were often frosted or blocked to prevent the outside world from looking in. The lighting was dim, usually provided by flickering gas lamps that left soot on the ceiling. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, cheap whiskey, and tobacco smoke. The floor was covered in sawdust, which served a grim logistical purpose. It was there to soak up the spilled liquor, the mud from the streets, and the spittle of the patrons. It was a dark, damp, and fundamentally dirty environment. It smelled of fermentation and neglect. To the crusaders of the temperance movement, the saloon was the breeding ground of poverty, domestic violence, and moral decay. It was where a man went to spend his wages and lose his soul. But the temperance movement faced a difficult problem. You could ban the alcohol, but you could not ban the thirst. And more importantly, you could not ban the need for a third place. Men needed somewhere to go that wasn't work and wasn't home. They needed a place to stand at a counter, talk to their neighbors, and hold a glass in their hand. If you took away the saloon, you left a vacuum in the social fabric of the city. The soda fountain was the answer. It was the moral bar, a temple of sobriety designed to mimic the social function of the saloon, but stripped of the sin. The contrast was deliberate and aggressive. If the saloon was dark, the soda fountain would be bright. If the saloon smelled of yeast and rot, the soda fountain would smell of vanilla and citrus. If the saloon was hidden behind frosted glass, the soda fountain would have massive, clear plate glass windows that invited the sunlight in. This was not just interior design, it was a moral statement. Drinking a soda became a virtuous act, a badge of honor for the teetotaler. The marketing of the era presented the fountain as a place where a man could take his wife and children without fear of scandal. It was clean, it was safe, it was modern. The teetotaler, the person who had pledged total abstinence from alcohol, adopted the soda fountain as their headquarters. The glass of phosphate or the cola tonic became a badge of honor. It signaled that you were a productive, upright member of society. You were drinking sugar and caffeine, the fuels of industry, rather than alcohol, the fuel of sloth. This created a strange, unspoken civil war of beverages. On one side were the beer barons, the owners of the massive breweries who controlled the saloons. On the other were the soda magnates and the pharmacists. They were fighting for the same throat. The beer industry argued that soda was a chemical slurry, a belly wash made of acid and gas. The soda industry argued that beer was a poison that destroyed families. The soda fountain won the propaganda war because it aligned itself with the future. The saloon felt like a relic of a darker, dirtier past. The soda fountain, with its gleaming fixtures and scientific syrups, felt like progress. It was the drink of the electrified city. But there was a catch to this moral victory. The clean environment of the soda fountain was, in many ways, an illusion. The white marble and the polished silver were designed to project an image of hygiene that did not actually exist. The moral bar was about to become a theatre of cleanliness, where the performance of sanitation was more important than the reality. To see this, you have to look past the bright lights and focus on the stone itself. You have to look at the marble. The counter was the altar. In the grand pharmacies of Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia, the soda fountain was not merely a piece of furniture. It was a monolith of stone. To convince the public that this was a place of purity, a moral bar, far removed from the sawdust and spittoons of the saloon, the industry turned to the architecture of the ancient world. They built their empires out of marble. It was a deliberate sensory engineering. Marble is dense, it is heavy, and crucially, it is cold. When a customer in a wool suit, sweating from the summer heat of the industrial city, leaned their elbows against the counter, the stone felt like a blessing. It sapped the heat from the skin. It signaled, before a single drop was poured, that relief had arrived. The sheer tonnage of rock imported for these fountains was staggering. They used white Carrara marble from Italy to signify cleanliness. They used deep green Verde antique to suggest nature. They used black and gold Egyptian marble to suggest luxury. These were not simple tables. They were war temples, massive structures that rose from the floor to the ceiling, often 12 feet high, crowded with Corinthian columns, carved friezes, and statues of Greek goddesses holding pitchers of water. The goal was to overwhelm the eye. If the saloon was a place of shadows, the soda fountain was a machine of light. Behind the marble counter stood the back bar, a towering wooden superstructure fitted with massive plate glass mirrors. These mirrors served a logistical purpose. They reflected the light from the newly invented electric bulbs, magnifying the brightness of the room until it dazzled. In the 1890s, electric light was still a novelty, a symbol of the future. By flooding the room with this harsh, artificial glare, the pharmacist was making a promise. We have nothing to hide. The light bounced off the polished silver spigots, the crystal syrup jars, and the white tile floors. It created an atmosphere of aggressive sterilization. It was hygiene theatre at its finest. Everything was designed to look clean. The syrup pumps were silver-plated so they would gleam. The glasses were thin and delicate, implying refinement. The floor was mopped hourly. To the eye, it was a laboratory of refreshment. But if you looked closer, if you looked past the glare of the electric chandelier and the cool touch of the Italian stone, the hygiene theatre was just that, a performance. And like all performances, what happened backstage was a different story. The weak link in this chain of purity was the water, not the carbonated water in the drink, but the water used to clean the glass. In a busy fountain on a Saturday afternoon, hundreds of customers would pass through. They all drank from glass tumblers, and in the late 19th century, there was no mechanical dishwasher. There was no hot water sterilization cycle. There was only the tumbler washer. This was usually a small, lead-lined basin set into the marble counter, filled with water. Sometimes it had a small fountain in the center that sprayed upward, but often it was simply a pool of standing water. When a customer finished their phosphated lemonade or their Coca-Cola, the clerk would take the sticky glass, dip it into the basin, give it a quick swirl, and place it back on the rack. That was the extent of the sanitation. As the day wore on, the water in the basin would grow murky. It would become a soup of backwash, saliva, leftover syrup, and cream. The rinse did not clean the glass. It merely coated it in the diluted residues of the previous 50 customers. The rim of the glass, where the mouth touched, was rarely scrubbed. The marble counter, for all its beauty, hid a multitude of sins. The syrup pumps, if not taken apart and boiled, a laborious task that was often skipped, would become clogged with crystallized sugar. In the heat of the pharmacy, these sugary pipes became breeding grounds for bacteria and magnets for ants. The slime that formed in the drain pipes was legendary among the workers. So, while the customer leaned against the cool, white stone, admiring their reflection in the pristine mirror, they were often drinking from a vessel that was a biological hazard. The moral bar was clean in spirit, but in practice, it was a petri dish. The illusion held because the lights were bright and the stone was expensive. But to keep this machine running, to pump the syrup, chip the ice, and rinse the glass in the grey water, you needed a specific kind of operator. You needed a performer. You needed the jerk. To operate a machine of this magnitude, you needed more than a clerk. You needed a pilot. The marble counter and the silver pumps were impressive, but they were static. To bring the moral bar to life, to turn the syrup and the gas into a social event, the pharmacy needed a new kind of laborer. They needed a young man who was part chemist, part showman, and part machine. They needed the soda jerk. The name has become a caricature, a retro costume you see in 1950s diners, but the etymology of the term is rooted in the physical violence of the job. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the draft arms of the soda fountain did not operate with the gentle push of a button. They were mechanical valves, heavy and spring-loaded, often made of solid brass or silver. They resisted you. To open the valve and release the pressurized carbonated water, the operator had to grab the handle and pull it forward with a sharp, sudden motion. He didn't pull it. He jerked it. It was a repetitive, percussive movement, performed hundreds of times a shift. It was a title earned through the biomechanics of the shoulder joint, and the man performing it was dressed to match the hygiene theatre of the room. The standard uniform was a crisp white linen jacket and the white paper or cloth cap. This was not a fashion choice, it was a psychological one. The white coat visually linked the soda jerk to the pharmacist at the back of the store and, by extension, to the doctor. It suggested that the chocolate phosphate or the cherry smash he was serving was a clinical preparation. It was a uniform that promised cleanliness, even if the cuffs were often stained with brown vanilla extract and sticky red syrup by the end of the rush. But the true value of the soda jerk was the performance. Making a soda was not a simple act of pouring, it was a piece of fluid dynamics. The draft arm on a professional fountain had two settings, controlled by the angle of the jerk. First, there was the fine stream. This was a high-pressure, needle-like jet of carbonated water. The jerk would shoot this directly into the syrup at the bottom of the glass. The force of the jet was so strong that it agitated the heavy, viscous sugar sludge, mixing it instantly with the water, without the need for a spoon. It created a turbulent, frothy head of foam that rose to the rim. Then, he would shift the handle to the coarse stream. This released a gentle, high-volume flow of water that filled the rest of the glass without breaking the bubbles. It was a delicate balance. Too much fine stream and the drink was all foam. Too much coarse stream and the syrup sat unmixed at the bottom, a layer of cloying sugar beneath a glass of plain water. The best operators could do this with two hands, filling two glasses simultaneously, crossing their arms in the air like a magician. They would toss a scoop of ice cream into the air and catch it in the glass. They would spin the spoon. They created a rhythm, clink, hiss, splash, slide, that became the soundtrack of the American afternoon. He was the bartender for the innocent. He was the confessor for the high school student and the flirt for the secretary. In a dry county, or during the height of Prohibition, the soda jerk held the keys to the only vice left in town, sugar and caffeine. He knew the regulars. He knew who wanted extra bitters in their tonic to settle a hangover and who wanted extra syrup to cure a heartbreak. He controlled the social temperature of the room as carefully as he controlled the temperature of the ice. But while the jerk was the soul of the fountain, he was ultimately just a servant to the true idol of the pharmacy. He was merely the operator of the silver altar that loomed over him. To understand the worship, you have to look at the idol itself. If the marble counter was the stage and the soda jerk was the performer, then the fountain itself was the lead actor. It was the idol that demanded the worship. In the late 19th century, you did not simply buy a machine to dispense soda water, you commissioned a cathedral. The manufacturers of these devices, companies like James W. Tufts of Boston or Charles Lippincott of Philadelphia, were not building kitchen appliances, they were building architectural follies. The ornate machinery of the Victorian soda fountain was designed to dominate the room, to tower over the customer, and to make the act of buying a nickel glass of mineral water feel like a religious sacrament. The central feature was the draft arm. This was the silver-plated pipe that rose from the counter like the neck of a swan or the head of a gargoyle. It was heavy, solid, and cold to the touch. The handle was not a simple lever. It was often carved from genuine Mexican onyx or ivory, polished until it felt like a gemstone in the hand. The spout was shaped like the beak of an eagle or the mouth of a fish. Behind these arms stood the back bar, a towering superstructure that often reached 12 feet in height. It was a riot of materials. You would see columns of variegated marble, mirrors framed in mahogany, and stained glass lamps that cast a colored glow over the syrups. The syrup pumps themselves were lined up like the stops of a pipe organ. They were silver-plated and engraved with the names of the flavors in elegant flowing script. vanilla, sarsaparilla, lemon, don't care. The aesthetic was explicitly ecclesiastical. The fountains were designed to look like altars or temples. They featured domes, spires, and finials. They had niches for statues of Greek goddesses or cherubs holding grapes. The intention was psychological. By framing the soda fountain as a temple, the pharmacist elevated the status of the drink. You weren't just drinking sugar water, you were participating in a ritual of purity and civilization. But beneath the silver plating and the onyx handles, there was a chemical war being fought. The ornate machinery was beautiful, but it was also self-destructive. The enemy was the very thing the machine was designed to dispense: carbonated water. Carbonated water is, by definition, carbonic acid. It is corrosive. In the 19th century, stainless steel did not exist. The pipes inside the fountain were usually made of block tin or lead, which was soft and relatively resistant, but the fittings, the valves, and the spigots were often made of brass or copper plated with silver. Silver tarnishes. It reacts with sulfur in the air to form a black layer of sulfide. But more dangerously, if the silver plating wore off, which it inevitably did from the constant friction of the jerk, the acidic soda water would come into contact with the copper or brass underneath. This created verdigris. It is a bright green, poisonous crust of copper acetate. It is the color of the Statue of Liberty, but you do not want it in your drink. If a fountain was not meticulously maintained, the first glass of the day would come out with a faint metallic tang and a greenish tint. It was a literal dose of copper poisoning. To prevent this, the maintenance of the machine was a full-time job. The silver had to be polished daily. The marble had to be wiped down to prevent the citric acid in the fruit syrups from etching the stone. The leather washers in the draft arms had to be replaced constantly as they dried out and cracked. The ornate machinery was a high-maintenance diva. It required constant labor just to keep it from dissolving itself. And perhaps that is why it died. As the 20th century progressed, the cathedral style of fountain began to look old-fashioned. It looked like a relic of a dusty, over-decorated past. The rise of Art Deco and streamline moderne in the 1930s brought a new aesthetic: speed, hygiene, and efficiency. The towering marble temples were torn down. The silver swans were melted for scrap. In their place came the bobtail unit. This was a low, flat, rectangular box made of stainless steel. It had no gargoyles, it had no onyx handles, it had no soul. The machinery was hidden under the counter. The syrup pumps became simple plastic or metal plungers. The draft arm became a functional gun on a hose. The theatre was gone. The soda fountain had ceased to be an altar and had become an appliance. The mystery of the back bar was replaced by the efficiency of the assembly line. The drink was safer, certainly. The stainless steel did not corrode. The verdigris was gone. But so was the reverence. The customer was no longer a pilgrim at a silver shrine. They were just a consumer waiting for a squirt of syrup. And as the machine lost its magic, the person drinking from it began to change as well. The moral bar had done its job too well. It had created a safe space for the public, but it had also created a dependency. The innocent tonic was about to reveal its dark side. The marble was cool, the silver was polished, and the lights were bright. The moral bar had successfully created a sanctuary of hygiene and sobriety. But if you stood in the corner of a busy pharmacy in 1895 and watched the customers closely, you would begin to notice a pattern. You would see the same faces. You would see the same man in the same grey suit walking through the door at 10 a.m., then again at 2 p.m., and perhaps once more before the shop closed. He did not look like a man enjoying a casual refreshment. He looked like a man on a schedule. He looked like a man who was being pulled by an invisible wire. In the late 19th century, a new term entered the American lexicon. It was whispered by pharmacists and printed in the sensationalist papers. They called these people soda fiends. It is a jarring term. We associate the word fiend with the opium dens of Victorian London or the gin alleys of the slums. We do not associate it with a young woman in a high-collared dress sipping a vanilla phosphate. But the term was accurate. The soda fountain, for all its claims of moral purity, had become the distribution point for a socially acceptable, mass-market chemical dependency. Consider the cocktail we have just assembled. You have the massive, unfiltered dose of caffeine from the cola nut. You have the localized numbing and mood elevation of the coca leaf, or at the very least, the memory of it. You have the potential presence of lithium salts to flatten out your anxiety, and holding it all together, you have a concentration of sugar that would shock a modern pancreas. This was not a beverage. It was a stack. It was a pharmacological bomb designed to trigger the reward centers of the brain, and it worked. The soda fiend was not a criminal. They were usually a clerk, a housewife, or a businessman. They were the people who were running the engines of the industrial age, and they had discovered that this dark, fizzy syrup was the only thing that made the noise of the city bearable. The addiction began with the morn embrace. This was the first glass of the day, consumed on the way to work. It cured the headache, a headache that was, ironically, caused by the withdrawal from the previous day's sugar and caffeine. The relief was instantaneous. The carbonation hit the stomach lining, speeding up the absorption of the drugs. The sugar hit the bloodstream. The caffeine hit the nervous system. The fog lifted. The neurasthenia vanished. But the biology of the soft drink is cruel. The spike is high, but the drop is steep. By the early afternoon, the energy would fade. The hands would start to tremble. The tired nerves would return with a vengeance. And so, the fiend would return to the counter. It became a ritual of maintenance. In the southern United States, where the soda habit was particularly strong, the slang for a soft drink was telling. They didn't call it a soda, they called it a dope. I'm going to get a dope. Do you want a dope? The word was casual, but the implication was clear. Deep down, everyone knew that this wasn't just flavored water. It was a substance. It was a crutch. The behavior of the soda fiend began to mimic the behavior of the alcoholic they were supposed to be replacing. There were reports of men who would spend their entire lunch allowance on tonics, drinking 5 or 6 glasses in a row, seeking that initial buzz that the first glass provided. There were women who would hide their consumption from their husbands, visiting different pharmacies in a circuit so that no single soda jerk would know how much they were drinking. The moral bar had created a trap. The temperance movement had spent decades demonizing alcohol as the root of all evil, arguing that it destroyed the will and enslaved the body. They had championed the soda fountain as the virtuous alternative, but now they were watching a generation of teetotalers develop the shakes if they didn't get their afternoon sarsaparilla. The irony was bitter. The drink that was invented to cure the morphine addict, like John Pemberton, had created the soda drunkard. The cure had become the disease. The physical toll was real. The soda dyspepsia became a common complaint, a stomach ruined by the constant bath of carbonic acid, sugar, and peppers. The teeth of the heavy users began to rot. The nerves, stimulated to the breaking point day after day, began to fray. The tonic that was supposed to build up the constitution was slowly breaking it down. Society began to realize that the soft in soft drink was a lie. There was nothing soft about a chemical leash. The moral bar was not a temple, it was a dispensary, and the government, watching this unregulated experiment in mass medication, finally decided that the party was over. The era of the secret recipe was about to collide with the era of federal law. The marble was a prisoner. For decades, the cod neck bottle had defined the sound and the weight of a carbonated drink. It was a heavy, clumsy vessel, a thick glass fortress designed to trap a single glass sphere against a rubber washer. It clinked. It rattled. It was a toy for children and a headache for the bottler. The logistical reality of the marble bottle was grim. It was expensive to manufacture, difficult to clean, and prone to catastrophic failure if the glass had even a microscopic flaw. But its greatest weakness was that it was a returnable asset. The bottler needed the bottle back. To make a profit, that heavy glass container had to be collected, washed, often poorly, and refilled. It was a tether that kept the soda industry local. You couldn't ship a cod bottle across the country. The weight alone would bankrupt you, and the loss rate from breakage was a constant hemorrhage on the ledger. The industry was waiting for a way to sever the tether. They were waiting for something disposable. In 1892, a mechanical engineer named William Painter, working out of Baltimore, looked at the complex, reusable stoppers of his day and decided they were all wrong. He realized that the stopper shouldn't be a permanent part of the bottle. It shouldn't be a piece of machinery. It should be garbage. He invented the crown cork. To the modern eye, it is the most banal object in the world. It is the crimped metal cap you twist off and flick into the trash without a second thought. But in 1892, it was a piece of radical engineering. Painter's design was deceptively simple. A tin disc with a corrugated flange, a skirt of metal teeth that could be crimped over a lip on the bottle's neck. The genius was not in the metal, but in what lay beneath it. Inside the tin cap was a thin disc of natural cork, and later a liner of paper or foil. When the machine pressed the cap down, the corrugated teeth gripped the glass, and the cork was compressed against the rim, creating a hermetic seal that was stronger than the pressure of the gas trying to escape. The original design had exactly 24 teeth. It was a specific number, calculated to distribute the pressure evenly around the circumference of the lip so the glass wouldn't shatter. It was a seal that didn't leak, didn't rattle, and didn't require a marble. But the true revolution was the concept of the single-use object. Painter's marketing slogan was brutal in its efficiency. The best bottle cap is the one you throw away. This changed the physics of the industry. Suddenly, the bottle didn't need a complex chamber for a marble. It didn't need a rubber washer that would rot. It just needed a simple, uniform lip. The bottling process sped up. Machines could now slam caps onto bottles at a rate of hundreds per minute, far faster than any cod neck could be filled. The sensory experience of the drink shifted overnight. The clink of the marble against the glass, that playful, rattling sound that had defined a generation of childhoods, was silenced. It was replaced by a new sound, a sound that would become the anthem of the 20th century, the pop. The sharp hiss of the gas escaping as the lever pried the crimped teeth away from the glass was the sound of freshness. It was the sound of a seal being broken for the first and only time. It told the drinker that this bottle hadn't been refilled by a local pharmacist using a murky bucket of water. It had been sealed in a factory, miles away, and stayed sealed until this exact moment. This piece of tin killed the local soda fountain. With the crown cap, a brewery or a bottling plant in Atlanta or St. Louis could ship their product by train to every corner of the nation. The soda didn't go flat. The cork didn't dry out. The marble didn't get stuck. The crown cap allowed the brand to detach itself from the soda jerk. You didn't need the performance of the man in the white coat anymore. You didn't need the marble counter or the silver tap. You just needed a bottle opener. The drink had become a product, sealed in a uniform, disposable armor, ready to survive the journey into the modern age. But as the bottle became tighter and the distribution became wider, The government began to ask a question that had been ignored for too long. What, exactly, was sealed inside? The cap kept the gas in, but it also locked the secrets away, and the era of the secret ingredient was about to end. The year 1906 was the year the pharmacy lost its mystery. It was the year the federal government passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, a piece of legislation that forced the secret recipes into the light. For decades, the soda barons had operated in a grey market of proprietary blends and unlisted stimulants. They had sold cures for neurasthenia and melancholy without ever admitting that the active ingredients were cocaine, lithium, and alcohol. But the law demanded a label, and the label demanded the truth. The transition was not immediate, but it was inevitable. The cocaine was scrubbed from the formula, the lithium was banned, the opiates were removed. The kick that had defined the 19th century tonic, that subtle chemical hum that vibrated in the back of the skull, was gone. The soda was no longer a drug, it was just a drink. To survive this loss of potency, the industry had to pivot. If they could not hook the customer with a stimulant, they would have to hook them with sweetness. The flavor profile of the American soda underwent a radical shift. The complex, earthy bitterness of the roots and barks, the sarsaparilla, the birch, the dandelion, began to fade. These were tastes acquired in the time of hardship, flavors that reminded the drinker of the soil. They were replaced by the fantasy flavors. The new sodas were bright, fruity, and aggressively sweet. They tasted of artificial grape, neon orange, and a vanilla that had never seen a bean. The sugar content skyrocketed. The spoonful of sugar that had once been used to help the medicine go down was now the medicine itself. The drink became a confection, a liquid candy designed for children rather than a tonic designed for weary workers. The manufacturing process changed to match this sanitized palate. The back room of the apothecary, with its copper kettles and open fires, was replaced by the industrial bottling plant. The smell of the factory floor shifted. It no longer smelled of boiling wood and reducing sap. It smelled of ozone, lubricant, and high-pressure steam. The sludge, that thick, hand-stirred reduction of botanicals, was obsolete. Modern syrup was made in massive stainless steel vats that held thousands of gallons. These vessels were sterile, efficient, and cold. They were mixed by motor-driven paddles that never tired and never varied. The ingredients arrived not in burlap sacks from the rainforest, but in steel drums from chemical laboratories. The spent coca leaf is the perfect symbol of this era. To maintain the trademark flavor of the most famous soda in the world, the company still imported the coca leaves from Peru. But before they went into the vat, they were sent to a special facility in New Jersey, where the cocaine was chemically extracted and discarded, or sold for legitimate medical use. The leaves that went into the drink were ghosts. They provided the flavor of the plant, but none of its power. The soul of the ingredient had been surgically removed. The final nail in the coffin of the old soda fountain was not the law, but the appliance. In the 1920s and 30s, the electric refrigerator began to move into the American kitchen. The Kelvinator and the Frigidaire changed the geography of thirst. You no longer needed to walk to the corner pharmacy to get a cold drink. You did not need the marble counter or the ice shaver. You could have a cold bottle of soda in your own home, at any hour of the day or night. The ritual was broken. The social act of drinking a soda, standing at the counter, talking to the jerk, listening to the hiss of the draft arm, was replaced by a private act. You opened the white metal box in your kitchen, took out a glass bottle, and drank it alone. The moral bar was closed. The hygiene theatre was unnecessary. The soda had become a utility, as common and unexciting as tap water, stored in the dark, waiting to be consumed in silence. The danger was gone. The dirt was gone. The drug was gone. But in the process of cleaning up the industry, we lost the sensory connection to the ingredients. We traded the complex, dangerous reality of the apothecary for the safe, consistent, and fundamentally boring reality of the supermarket shelf. We had sanitized the history right out of the bottle. Now, let us step away from the marble counter. Let us leave the smell of the apothecary shop with its drying roots and boiling syrups, and step into the fluorescent hum of the present day. Stand in front of a modern vending machine. It is a large, rectangular box, usually glowing with LED lights, humming with the sound of a compressor that never sleeps. It is the great-grandchild of the soda fountain, but it has no face, it has no hands, it has no white coat. You insert a bill or tap a card. You press a button. There is a mechanical whir, a sudden drop, and a heavy thunk as the product hits the retrieval bin. You reach down into the slot, and your hand closes around an object that feels cold and light. This is the aluminum can. It is a marvel of engineering, lightweight, stackable, and virtually indestructible. It chills rapidly and seals perfectly. But more importantly, it is a wall, an opaque, seamless wall. For the first time in this long history, you are drinking blind. You cannot see the liquid. You cannot see the bubbles rising. You cannot judge the viscosity of the syrup or the clarity of the water. The metal separates you completely from the source. You are trusting the brand, and the brand is trusting the machine. When you pull the tab, you hear that familiar crick, crack, hiss. It is a satisfying sound, a piece of acoustic branding that has been engineered to trigger thirst. But compare it to the theatre of the past. There is no marble clinking in the neck. There is no hiss of the draft arm fighting the pressure. There is no jerk of the handle. There is just the efficient, disposable breach of a sterile seal. And then you drink. The liquid that hits your tongue is cold, aggressively carbonated, and intensely sweet. But the sweetness is different. It is not the complex, caramel richness of the loaf sugar that had to be nipped with iron pliers. It is not even the cane sugar of the early 20th century. It is high fructose corn syrup. This ingredient is a logistical triumph. It is cheap, it is stable, and it can be pumped through pipes like oil. It keeps the cost of your soda down to pennies, but it has a specific texture. It is thicker than sugar water. It coats the tongue in a way that lingers, a cloying film that demands you take another sip to wash it away. It is a sweetness that has been designed in a laboratory to hit the bliss point, the exact level of sugar that overrides the brain's stop signal. The secret recipe that companies tout in their commercials is no longer a list of exotic botanicals from the rainforest or the mountains. It is a list of chemical compounds. The natural flavors listed on the back of the can are derived from sources that have been processed so heavily they would be unrecognizable to the farmers who grew them. The vanilla does not come from an orchid bean. It likely comes from processed wood pulp. The citric acid does not come from a lemon grove. It comes from a fermented black mold called Aspergillus niger, grown in a vat. We have traded the danger of the pharmacy for the safety of the factory. We have traded the inconsistent, sometimes explosive, sometimes medicinal reality of the 19th century tonic for a product that is perfectly safe, perfectly consistent, and perfectly boring. You can buy this can in a gas station in Nebraska or a vending machine in Tokyo, and it will taste exactly the same. That is a miracle of logistics. But it is a defeat of the senses. The danger is gone. The cocaine is gone. The exploding glass is gone. But so is the connection. You are no longer drinking a piece of the earth, a root, a bark, a leaf, a spring. You are drinking a piece of the industrial complex. The aluminium wall separates you from the source, and perhaps, that is for the best. Because if you could see what was inside, the magic might disappear entirely. But history is stubborn. You cannot completely sterilize the past. Even in the age of high fructose corn syrup and red dye number 40, there are echoes of the apothecary shop. There are small, stubborn pockets where the sludge survived. If you look past the vending machine, you will see the revival. The craft soda movement is not just a nostalgic affectation, it is a subconscious attempt to reclaim the heavy sensory grit we lost. Go to a specialty grocer and pick up a bottle of fermented ginger beer. Not the clear, sugary ale, but the cloudy stuff. The stuff with sediment at the bottom. Turn it over gently. Watch the cloud of ginger root and yeast rise like a storm. When you crack that seal, it does not smell like candy. It smells of the earth. It smells pungent, spicy, and almost aggressive. When you drink it, it burns. It catches in the back of the throat. It is a shock to a modern palate that has been trained on smooth, harmless syrup. It tastes, briefly, of danger. This is the sensory echo. It is the ghost of the 18th century brewery experiment. It reminds us that soda was originally a fermented product, a living thing that changed in the bottle. Then there are the bitters. Go to any modern cocktail bar, the kind with the dim lights and the serious bartenders, and look at the small bottles on the counter. Angostura, Peychaud's. These are the direct descendants of the patent medicine era. They are concentrated tinctures of gentian root, cinchona bark, and wormwood. They are intensely bitter, medicinal, and unpalatable on their own. Yet, we still dash them into our drinks. We still crave that medicinal edge. The old-fashioned cocktail is essentially a preserved specimen of the 19th century pharmacy. Sugar, water, spirits, and bitters. It is a stomach cure that we have repurposed as a luxury. It is the last place where the root boil is still respected. And finally, consider the bubbles themselves. Why do we love carbonation? Why do we crave that sharp, prickly sensation on the tongue? Physiologically, it makes no sense. The sensation of carbonation is actually a pain response. The carbonic acid triggers the nociceptors, the pain receptors, in the trigeminal nerve. It is the same nerve that detects the burn of chili peppers or the sting of mustard. We are not enjoying a flavor. We are enjoying a mild, controlled chemical burn. We have learned to interpret this pain as freshness. We have learned to love the bite. It is a small, physical reminder of the violent chemistry that birthed the industry. Every time you swallow a gulp of highly carbonated water and feel that tear-inducing sharpness in your nose, you are feeling the ghost of the oil of vitriol dripping onto the chalk. You are feeling the pressure that shattered the glass in the pharmacy basement. The craft revival is trying to put the hard back in soft drinks. It is trying to remind us that a tonic should have texture. It should have a finish that isn't just sugar. It is a rejection of the aluminium wall. It is a desire to hold a cold, heavy glass bottle, to see the sediment swirling in the light, and to taste the roots and the bark that once promised to cure us of our deep melancholy. It is a small rebellion, but every time you choose the bottle with the strange, herbal label over the red can, you are stepping back into the apothecary. You are admitting that maybe, just maybe, you want your drink to fight back. We have traveled a long way tonight. We began this long journey at the edge of a volcanic spring, smelling the sulfur and the heat of the earth. We watched a scientist suspend a bowl of water over a vat of fermenting beer, waiting for the invisible gas to transform a still, flat liquid into something alive. We stood on the frozen lakes of New England, listening to the iron saws cut through the ice, and we followed those blocks as they melted their way to India. We have seen the blood on the pharmacist's leather glove, the sharp shards of the exploding glass, and the shaking hands of the soda fiend waiting for their morning dose of raw cocaine and caffeine. We have heard the rattle of the marble in the cod neck bottle and the silence of the crown cap that sealed the world. It is a heavy history for such a light drink. When you look at the glass sitting on your table now, it seems innocent. The bubbles are small and frantic, racing to the surface to escape. But they are carrying the weight of the entire industrial revolution. Every single fizz is an echo of the chalk and the acid. Every sharp clink of the ice is a memory of the sawdust ships and the desperate race against the tropical sun. The sweetness that coats your tongue is the legacy of the sugar loaf and the iron nippers, a rare luxury that became a global commodity. You are drinking a liquid museum. You are consuming the ghosts of the temperance movement, the remnants of the drug trade, and the triumph of the assembly line. It is a logistical miracle that this object exists at all. It required the invention of the steam engine, the mastery of refrigeration, and the complete rewiring of the human palate to make it possible. We took the bitter roots of the earth, the sarsaparilla, the birch, the kola nut, and we boiled and beat them into submission with sugar until they became candy. The glass is empty now. The ice has melted into a thin, watery pool at the bottom. The cold condensation is sliding down the outside of the vessel, leaving a ring of water on the wood of your table. The energy of the carbonation is gone. The violence of the gas has finally exhausted itself, leaving only a flat, sweet, and sticky silence. So, the next time you reach for that cold aluminium cylinder or that heavy glass bottle, do not just drink it. Pause. Listen to the sound of the crimped metal seal breaking. Smell the sharp, acidic tang of the gas before the sugar hits your nose. Acknowledge the long, dangerous, and deeply human struggle that put that simple beverage in your hand. Respect the volatile chemistry. Respect the melting ice. And once the bubbles have settled and the noise of the day has faded away, you can finally close your heavy eyes. Now, rest well.